Nucleic acids are also a type of macromolecule that are polymers. And remember, polymers are just long or kind of big molecules made up of chains of smaller building blocks bonded together. So there are three main types of nucleic acids. There is deoxyribonucleic acid, which is more commonly abbreviated to DNA. Ribonucleic acid, which is also just referred to as RNA, and adenosine triphosphate, which is abbreviated as ATP. The monomers of nucleic acids are smaller building blocks or molecules called nucleotides. And nucleotides have basically three major components to them. They consist of a sugar. If it's in DNA, that sugar is deoxyribose. If it's in RNA, it is ribose. There's also a phosphate group, and then a nitrogenous base, or a base that has nitrogen in it. There are four possible bases that can be found in DNA, and four that can be found in RNA. So the five possible bases here are guanine, cytosine, adenine, thymine, and uracil. And four of those are in DNA and four are in RNA. So we'll take a look at that on the next slides. But first I just want to show here how this is a monomer. So this is one nucleotide, and then this monomer is attached to another nucleotide, which is attached to another nucleotide, and this is what gives us our polymer of a nucleic acid. So this could be a polymer of RNA, for example. And you'll notice here with these nitrogen-containing bases, so this is what just the base part of the molecule looks like, and they all have that little N for nitrogen, but they do look different. Adenine and guanine are bigger. They actually have two rings with nitrogen in them, whereas uracil, thymine, and cytosine are smaller with only a single ring, but they still all have that nitrogen. So DNA is a type of nucleic acid, and it looks like a ladder that has been twisted around itself, and we call that a double helix. So this is our double helix here, and on the outside of the double helix, so these would be like the supports of the ladder, that is where we find the sugar, deoxyribose, and the phosphate groups that are bonded together. Now the rungs of the ladder, so the parts that stick in the middle here, these are the nitrogen-containing bases. And in DNA, we can find guanine, cytosine, adenine, and thymine. So I remember this by using the little mnemonic GCAT. So you can find guanine, cytosine, adenine, and thymine in a molecule of DNA. In humans, DNA is found in the nucleus of cells. There's also a little bit found in mitochondria, but the majority of the genetics are in the nucleus of cells. And they're actually packaged or organized into structures called chromosomes. So your chromosomes are just kind of a highly structured way of storing really, really long strands of DNA. So the human genome, so all of the genetic material in a human, is 3 billion base pairs long. So you can imagine that that's a really, really long piece of DNA. So the chromosomes just help to kind of organize that DNA so it doesn't get all tangled up. The main function of DNA is the genetic code. So genes are just segments of DNA that are found on a chromosome, and each gene codes for a protein. So genes basically contain the recipe for your body to make proteins, and that recipe is stored in the molecule of DNA. RNA has kind of a similar structure to DNA, except it only has a single strand. So it's like you take a ladder and cut it in half. So it's only got one strand. It still has a backbone like DNA, so it's got deoxyribose and phosphate. And it also has nitrogen-containing bases that are sticking up from that backbone. The main difference between DNA and RNA with those bases is that RNA has GCow instead of GCat. So remember in DNA we said that we could find guanine, cytosine, adenine, and thymine, but in RNA that thymine is replaced with something called uracil. So in RNA you can find guanine, cytosine, adenine, and uracil. And once again I remember that because I remember GCow. In humans, RNA can be found in the cell nucleus and the cytoplasm. So the RNA is actually able to move between the nucleus to the rest of the cell, whereas DNA is stuck primarily in the nucleus. And the function is that it aids in the synthesis of proteins. So it's able to take the recipe stored in DNA and transports it to a cellular organelle called a ribosome. And the ribosomes is where the proteins are actually made. A third nucleic acid is ATP, which stands for adenosine triphosphate. And this molecule is the major energy molecule in all living things. So you can see here it's made up of an adenine base, so this is the nitrogen containing base, and a ribose sugar, so that's the similarity with DNA and RNA, and it also has a phosphate group, but the big difference is it's got 3 phosphate groups stuck to it, and that's where we get the triphosphate. So if we were to get rid of these two here, we would just have a normal nitrogenous base. We'd have a nucleotide. But there are extra phosphates on here, and these red bonds in between the phosphate groups, that is where energy is stored. So when you make a bond, you store energy, and then your body has structures that can break bonds, and when it breaks those bonds, it releases that energy, and the energy gets transferred to something else. So for example, in order for your muscle to contract, your muscle cells have to be able to break a bond between the phosphates in ATP and transfer that energy to the muscle cell so the muscle cell can contract. So in humans, we find ATP in basically all body cells, with maybe a few exceptions. But each cell primarily makes its own source of ATP. As we mentioned, it's the energy molecule of cells. Those bonds between the phosphates is where the energy is stored. So when we make ATP, we can take ADP, which is just the adenine, ribose, and 2 phosphates, and we can add that third phosphate on there. When we add that third phosphate, we're storing energy in the form of this chemical bond. And it's kind of like charging a battery. You're storing energy there. Now later, say in your muscles will be able to go in and break that bond and transfer that energy to the muscle cells so that they can contract.